After over 2 years, we finally have a new MCU movie. Yes! In those 2 years, I've rewatched all the movies, I've written a ton of notes, I've listened to what you had to say, and I've rethought a bunch of my opinions. So today we're gonna stop and rank all 24 MCU movies from the worst to the best. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Share your ranking of all 24 MCU films. My list is not the right list. It's just my list, and I would love to see yours. And let's get started. In last place, Thor the Dark World, easily the most mediocre film in the entire franchise. While it tries to do a bunch of things like Lord of the Rings in space, a rom-com, a soap opera, a buddy comedy, it doesn't do anything new, interesting, or compelling with any of it.
Not impressed.
The movie kicks off with 35 minutes of exposition and setup, but somehow still the plot is unclear. Events occur without proper context or explanation, so they have no meaning for the audience. The one event that actually emotionally resonates with us, the death of Loki, is undone by the end of the film. Malekith is easily the most forgettable and boring villain in the entire MCU. He's not given a single defining characteristic or personality trait. He's just an evil dark elf that wants the ether. To be fair though, it's still a watchable film. Technically speaking, it's professionally made. The shots are in focus. The actors are all incredibly talented. The special effects are all top-notch and look professional. This movie has all the things it's supposed to have. It should work, but it doesn't.
Some things should work, but do they?
Coincidentally, this is the only MCU film I didn't see in the theater, and apparently I picked a good one to skip. Number 23, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Now I know many of you are thinking, how dare you? I get it, but honestly, I've tried to like this movie, and every single time I watch it, I find the characters unlikable, the story unfocused, and the tone distasteful.
Not a great plan.
The tone jumps from cruel scenes of torture to Looney Tunes humor to patricide in a matter of seconds.
That escalated quickly.
Like in the finale of this movie, Star-Lord learns that his father killed his mother. He pulls out a gun, shoots his father in the face. This should be this gut-wrenching emotional moment. And then 10 seconds later, it cuts to a David Hasselhoff bit.
You've made a huge mistake.
Lastly, for the first 70% of this movie, Ego just drops exposition, takes naps, and plays catch. Our heroes don't even know that there's a villain scheme going on until right before the final battle. This means there's no sense of urgency or forward momentum with the plot line throughout the whole middle act of the film. And when it comes to the Sovereign, they're basically self-parody. If you think this movie is awesome, that's great. I don't want to take that away from you, but...
Well, agree to disagree.
Next up, Iron Man 2, an unsatisfying mix of way too many plot lines, too little action, and some pretty obvious notes to try and set up the upcoming Avengers movie. Jon Favreau openly stated that he wanted a 3-year turnaround after the first movie so he could get the script right, but the studio insisted on a 2-year turnaround because they were trying to get to the Avengers.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
So there was no time to focus the story, so you end up with a movie that has enough plot lines for 3 different Iron Man movies, but no real clear central story. I think a big part of the problem with the movie is that Tony doesn't know that Whiplash is a threat until he's attacking people. At the beginning of the film, he doesn't know he exists, and in the middle act of the film, he thinks he's dead, so there's no sense of urgency in the story. Tony isn't trying to stop the villain, so the story just kind of meanders with all of these different subplots. There's also far too little action in this movie. The first action sequence isn't until 30 minutes into it, and then throughout the entire middle act of the film, our main villains are in a lab, and Tony's in a separate lab, and there's just not a lot of opportunity for big action sequences. Then again, when the action does take place, it's awesome. The individual scenes and plot lines are all fine, but the whole isn't as good as the parts. And it's a real shame because all the cast are at the top of their game. Number 21, Captain Marvel. An entertaining enough but awkward addition to the franchise. The movie works best when we're seeing a less world-weary Nick Fury discovering just how big the universe is. Samuel L. Jackson and his de-aging staging are at the top of their game. Ben Mendelsohn as Talos is great, and I kind of enjoyed kind of the X-Files-esque vibe when Carol and Fury are doing their investigation. But as a whole, the movie is clunky. It features a lot of awkward performances. A big part of the problem is that Captain Marvel herself is written to be difficult to connect with. She doesn't know who she is. People are telling her what to think. She's being told to control her emotions, and it just doesn't make her all that compelling.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
Even her powers feel totally undefined. Like, does she need a helmet to fly in space or not? And as a prequel, there's some nice little nuggets here and there. I like to see some of these characters when they're a little bit younger, but then there's other aspects to the movie where they are answering questions I was not asking with answers I did not like.
Those bad guys still in there somewhere. Oh, motherfucking!
So while there's still a lot to enjoy with this movie, it feels like a film that's still struggling with the issues that the rest of the MCU figured out back in Phase 1. Bringing us into the top 20 is Spider-Man Far From Home. The first post-Endgame MCU film turns out to be one of the most polarizing. Some of you see this placement and go... But unfortunately, I find this movie to be more entertaining than credible. On the positive side of things, the teenage cast is as charming as ever. Jake Gyllenhaal can play the fake hero, the mentor, and the psycho villain all to perfection, but it's also a movie that the more I think about it, the less it holds together on a story level. The basic premise of the film is that Tony Stark left his very dangerous glasses to a high schooler who had been dead for 5 years without any instructions.
Why?
It's such a glaring oversight and bad concept that it taints the entire back half of the movie for me. This is also like the 7th time a villain has been motivated by scorn for Tony Stark.
Hit me, baby, one more time.
To be entirely fair, it's a very watchable film, but for me, it sacrifices too much credibility to set up its narrative for it to be satisfying. Then we have the Incredible Hulk. This has always felt like the black sheep of the MCU. It's the only film in the franchise that was made by Universal, and for that reason, it feels very different. It has significantly less humor to it, and it just makes for a different experience than the rest of the films. I suspect at least partially one's enjoyment of this movie is based off how much nostalgia you have for the 1970s show. It's just jam-packed with Easter eggs, references, and homages. If you compare this movie to the 1970s show, it's a wonderful love letter to the fans. But if you compare it to the rest of the MCU, it's a dull film with too little humor and an odd tone. For me, I enjoy all the Hulk action in this movie. It has variety to it too. I also appreciate that neither of the antagonists set out to be villains. They're just following orders and trying to complete their mission. And I also love the fact that both of these guys are showing up in Phase 4 this year. Here I am! Still, parts of the story are clunky and certain plot lines are abandoned randomly. I'm pretty sure this is partially due to the fact that the movie was dramatically reworked in the editing room. Still, for me, this movie isn't the abomination that some people make it out to be, but it's not gonna smash your expectations either. At number 18, Thor. Like a lot of Phase 1, this movie's a little bit awkward and not as tonally consistent as the later films. Feels like they were struggling to figure out how do you balance the fantastical with the grounded, as well as the grandeur with the humor. Director Branagh brings his A game when it comes to the beauty of Asgard and all the Shakespearean family drama, but the tonal shift when you get to Earth is jarring. Now, obviously, a lot of that is intentional, but there's like literally 0 jokes in the first 30 minutes of the film, and then you get to Earth, and there's 2 slapstick jokes about Thor getting hit by a car. The cast across the board here is great, whether you're talking about the legacy actors that they cast for the parents, or the relative unknowns that they cast as the leads. Though you can tell Hemsworth, Hiddleston, and the writers are still trying to figure out the characters. Hemsworth doesn't quite have down Thor's bravado and humor, and Hiddleston plays Loki pretty low-key. Thor 1 also has a bit of the same problem as Iron Man 2, in that Thor doesn't know that there's this villain scheme going on throughout most of the film. He's just on his personal journey, so there isn't kind of this urgency to what he's doing until the very end, where he learns of the villain scheme and has to rush back to get to the climax of the movie. While it's still pretty good, it never quite makes you go,
I like it.
I know, it's great, right?
Another!
Number 17, Doctor Strange. Of all the films in the MCU, this is probably the film with the most creative and spellbinding visuals. Most special and visual effects inside of movies are trying to do something you can't do practically, but could exist within reality. Here, the images are inherently and intentionally violations of nature and physics. Kind of like in a Fast and the Furious movie.
I don't want to die!
Okay, that's a bad comparison. But it is like a mix of Inception, Dark City, a kaleidoscope, and Escher drawings, but as Marvel action sequences. As always, the movie is impeccably cast. Cumberbatch embodies the arrogance, the intelligence, the sarcasm, the brokenness of Doctor Strange, and Benedict Wong can do no Wong as Wong. That was kind of a fun sentence to say. But this is also one of the films where you can feel the MCU formula the most. Like they're just trying to squish the Doctor Strange mythology into the MCU blockbuster origin story template. Potentially, there's probably something interesting with this idea of Caecilius as a true believer in Dormammu, but both of them are just so underdeveloped, it's tough to care about anything that you're doing. Still, the experience of entering Marvel's wizarding world is a lot of fun and great to look at. Moving right along, Avengers Age of Ultron. Joss Whedon's follow-up to the Avengers has more of everything. The stakes are bigger, the emotions deeper, the quips more plentiful, the action more spectacular. But unfortunately, this is a movie where its ambitions far exceed its execution.
Bogus.
When the story focuses in on the entertainment and the emotions, the moments are just as good as in the first movie. The action has no shortage of iconic shots inside of it, and there's no shortage of Joss Whedon zingers thrown throughout the entire movie. Where the movie struggles is with the story and the storytelling. The film frequently has events take place that aren't explained until several scenes later on in the movie. As an example to it, the movie kicks off with the Avengers in action on a mission without any context or explanation. So we're playing catch up from the very beginning, and from there, it moved from plot point to plot point to plot point at such a breakneck speed that we don't know exactly what's going on and why. For me, I would argue that this is the most confusing movie in the MCU. So this is a movie with a bunch of great ideas and great moments, but the film as a whole doesn't really live up to its predecessor. Coming in at number 15, Iron Man 3. Shane Black's sense of humor fits Stark perfectly, and Stark himself is way more likable in this film than in Iron Man 2. In both movies, he's damaged and self-destructive, but in this movie, he's a flawed hero that's out to do heroic things. From beginning to end, he is trying to track down the bad guy and stop him. And he's also a lot funnier in this one. Like the other Iron Man movies, the action here is all great. The standout for me was the plane rescue sequence, but all of it is very cool stuff. But I think this works best as a subversive Shane Black action movie than as an MCU film. There's a bunch of plot lines in this movie that were just abandoned by the rest of the MCU. Pepper gets powers for about 90 seconds. Tony blows up all of his suits. I understand wanting to have a bunch of big twists and turns in your finale, but most of the stuff just didn't go anywhere. Whoops. And then there's things like the Mandarin twist that feel like Shane Black trying to be clever, but they're not very satisfying as an audience member.
Oh, that didn't work.
Now, I totally understand why a lot of comic book purists would feel betrayed by this movie, but there is a lot here to enjoy. But it is a movie that feels like they never ironed out how this one fits into the MCU. Number 14, Ant-Man and the Wasp. Following just a couple months after Infinity War, this feels like the MCU intentionally not swinging for the fences, just trying to offer a light-hearted adventure filled with fun antics. Some people take issue with the film's ant-sized stakes, but after the destruction of Asgard, the overthrow of the King of Wakanda, and Thanos' snap, It was kind of refreshing to have an MCU movie that doesn't have the weight of the world on its shoulders. It's just a simple MacGuffin story about several different groups swarming on a piece of technology. Paul Rudd is as likable and innocent as ever. Michael Pena returns as a scene stealer, and Michelle Pfeiffer is a nice little addition for her few scenes, and Evangeline Lilly packs a nice sting. And then this movie also sets up one of the best character arcs in the entire MCU.
How'd you do it, Scott? The card trick?
Sir, can you knock?
James E. Woo, FBI.
This movie isn't trying to be the biggest or the best Marvel movie, but it is a pleasant one. Next up, Black Widow, the missing Phase 3 movie that came out 5 years too late after the main character had died, and is the kickoff of Phase 4?
Wow, that was weird.
Unusual timing aside, it's a nice addition to the franchise. One of the things the MCU does so well is incorporating all these different genres while still feeling consistent with the rest of the series. Here we have a spy movie about a family, and that fits her character really nicely. What the movie does well is create a threat with weight to it by going personal and disturbing rather than just going bigger. Florence Pugh and David Harbour are the two standouts here. Both of them just have so much personality and bring a liveliness to every single scene that they're in, and it feels like their humor flows out of their personality. It's like someone you might even know rather than someone just dropping a whole bunch of quips. But while the movie does have a strong sense of humor at appropriate times, it's also one of the more mature MCU films that tackles a bunch of darker themes. Now, there's definitely some disappointing elements here. Taskmaster is basically a glorified henchman with a backstory, and Black Widow gets overshadowed in her own movie. Releasing it when they did can make it feel kind of inconsequential to the MCU as a whole, but that doesn't stop it from being another solid story about family. Number 12, AntMan. The novelty here is that this is a heist movie. It has the familiar beats, but still offers a unique experience. A big part of what makes these movies work is the charming cast. I love that Paul Rudd is an MCU superhero. He's so naturally and organically amusing while still feeling down to earth. And I also love that Michael Douglas is actually in these movies. And the final battle here is a great example of how you can make a sequence memorable when you can't go big, you go clever. On the negative, there's some unnecessarily convoluted elements here. Like, it's hilarious when Michael Pena recalls how he learned about the score, but that anecdote was Hank's actual plan, and there's roughly 14,604 versions of that story where something goes wrong, and only one where the movie takes place.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Anyway, one of the great things about watching these movies post-Endgame is that there's so many lines that have new meaning when you see the whole. Like in this movie, Hank says he spent half his life trying to keep his tech out of the hands of the Starks. What's the plot of Endgame? Tony Stark using PIM technology to save the universe. Put it all together and it's a nice change of pace. Sometimes you just want a heist movie where Michael Douglas talks to ants.
Ants. Ants.
Then we have Captain America: The First Avenger. This is a movie I frequently go back and forth on because I think it works so much better as an origin story than as a war movie. I love the first hour of this movie where it tells Steve's origin story. There's just this sense of old-fashioned nobility to it in a world where most superheroes are so broken and flawed. Steve Rogers' simplistic heroism is refreshing and inspiring. I mean, that first hour is some of my favorite stuff in the MCU.
That was
Awesome.
Likewise, the production design is top notch. They took a bunch of influence from a lot of the comics and cartoons from the 1940s, and it just feels like we've gone back in time inside the world of the MCU, but the character arcs and relationships are a lot more compelling than the mission to stop Red Skull. Like, he doesn't have much of a story. He just delivers exposition and hunts down different artifacts. There's just not much there to create urgency or stakes until the very end. So it's a bit of an uneven film, but the good stuff is all great. Bringing us into the top 10 is Thor Ragnarok. Looks like third time is the charm for the God of Thunder. Coming off the most mediocre film in the entire MCU, Taika Waititi injected this franchise with a double dose of Red Bull and humor. From the new characters to the old characters, new personalities to the score to the color palette, everything about this movie oozes personality and vibrance. Finally, the Thor movies really lean into one of their best assets, Chris Hemsworth's impeccable comedic timing, but he's not the only one that's funny. Everyone is laugh out loud funny in this movie, Jeff Goldblum and Korg being some of the standouts. Because the film is so funny, it's easy to forget just how much weight the plot actually carries, but a lot of the fault there does lie with Taika Waititi, who seemed unable to restrain his humor, and so several different times he undercuts the drama by throwing a joke in at an inappropriate point in time. Oops! And I get they need to show how powerful Hela is, but the treatment of the Warriors 3 is just inexcusable. With just a little bit more reserve, this movie could have delivered a ton of entertainment and emotion and been a top-tier MCU film for me.
We were on the verge of greatness. We were this close.
At number 9, Black Panther. For me, this is one of the most mature and thematically rich films in the franchise. Usually we go to these films for the unassuming escapism, but this movie had something to say, and it said it through storytelling while still delivering the spectacle that you expect. The real secret sauce here is Killmonger. What I mean by that is that you have a villain that in some sense has a noble cause, but is going about it in a truly villainous way that our hero must stop, but along the way wins enough of a moral victory that sways our hero to champion their cause in the right way. On the flip side, the action here isn't nearly as good as it should be. The Black Panther suit itself frequently looks too CGI and cartoony. Likewise, the idea of giving the hero a suit that can absorb bullet hits and turn it into power punches is a bit like giving the hero God mode for the action sequences, in which case when he has so few vulnerabilities, it takes away all the danger from the action in the movie.
That could have gone better.
But overall, it's still possibly the most mature and thoughtful film on this list, while still making room for war rhinos and sneaker puns, which can be very punny. Then we have SpiderMan Homecoming. The first MCU film dedicated to Spider-Man skips the origin story and goes straight to the high school antics. One of the best things about this movie for me is that it provides a teenager's perspective on the world of the MCU and being a hero. The teenage cast here are all charming and a lot of fun, and Holland is absolutely perfect as this naive but eager teenage hero. The film also gives Tony Stark something new to do, which both develops and matures his character. And when it comes to things I didn't know that I wanted, Marissa Tomei as Hot Aunt May. Good call, Kevin Feige. Vulture is actually a compelling villain. Instead of being like a sociopath out to blow up the world, he's just a guy that felt cheated by the system, and so he turns to crime to provide a way of life for his family. While this might not be the most ambitious film in the series, I think it might be the most rewatchable. Number 7, Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Now this is an interesting one for me because I've always thought this is a rock solid superhero movie. And at the same time, I've always been a little bit confused by the amount of hyperbolic praise the internet heaps onto it.
You have a problem with that?
And given Steve Rogers' simple black and white worldview, he's the perfect character to drop into the middle of this morally ambiguous tale. He's a simple man in a very complex world. Also, by diving into the politics, it gives us some of the best world building of the entire series. Add to that the amazing action. There's plenty of visual effects going on, but they did a lot of this practically and with real fight choreography. And this is another film where the small details are paid off so well in Endgame. It starts off with the running sequence in the line on your left that was so wonderfully used for the portal sequence. And it's those little details and callbacks that make the franchise so satisfying as a whole beyond just the superficial entertainment.
I like it a lot.
It's a great film with mature themes and a complex plot, but for me personally, it doesn't pull out as big of emotions as the films higher up on this list. Next up, The Avengers. It has a certain lightning in a bottle quality about it, as it was the first time there ever been like a big superhero team-up movie at this scale, but somehow Feige and Whedon cracked the code of how to balance the tones of all these different characters from all these different franchises and make a consistent, coherent narrative and vibe. Other studios have tried to copy the formula, but no one has come close to their success. Not even Whedon could replicate the results. Here, Whedon wisely decided to have a streamlined, straightforward narrative that provided plenty of opportunity for action as well as character interactions. To this day, I still think that this movie has some of the best witty banter as well as character chemistry. Likewise, the third act of this movie delivers one of the most crowd-pleasing, grin-on-your-face sequences of the entire series, and a big part of that is because every single character gets a moment in the spotlight doing something memorable and interesting. As great as the movie is as a whole, objectively speaking, it starts off pretty clunky and it slows to a crawl during the second act after Loki gets captured. But every time I watch this movie, I completely forget about all of that because it's so satisfying by the time the credits roll.
Excellent!
For me, there's just something special about what they were able to pull off with this film. In fifth place, Guardians of the Galaxy, when Marvel announced that they were going to adapt a fairly obscure comic about a talking raccoon whose best friend is a talking tree, and it was going to star the chubby guy from Parks and Rec, I kind of thought that they'd lost their minds.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Once again, I was very happy to be wrong. James Gunn poured his heart and soul into this movie and took what was the MCU's biggest risk and turned it into one of the most refreshing and personal stories in the series. Each of the characters is interesting and engaging on their own, but they're better together. It's a story about a group of broken people who come together and find family. And for a movie set in outer space about a talking plant, it has some of the most real and gut-wrenching moments. I mean, the movie starts off with a child watching his mother die of cancer. It's a movie that's so good that it manages to take a line as sappy as "We are Groot" and turn it into a real, heartfelt, tear-inducing moment. Add to that, it's got one of the absolute best soundtracks of the 21st century. Put it all together and you get a movie where I just instantly fell in love with these characters and this world. Moving along to Captain America Civil War, the first film of Phase 3 is one of the most consequential films in the entire MCU. What I absolutely love about these movies is Feige's ability to tell individual stories while also intertwining multiple franchises together to tell this bigger narrative, and Civil War is probably the ultimate example of that. It's a direct follow-up to both Age of Ultron and The Winter Soldier, and then 3 different movies follow-up characters directly after the events of this film. Some people have argued that the stakes in this movie were too low and the conflict didn't have enough weight to it. I even said that in my previous rankings. But the breakup of the Avengers from this film is what led to the vulnerability that Thanos exploited to win the Infinity War. The story manages to create a scenario where you can reasonably believe that the Avengers, based off their different backgrounds and competing values, would have very different responses to the Sokovia Accords. And not just the Avengers, the audience themselves would too, in which case you had people that were both Team Cap and Team Iron Man. I'm Team Cap. How about you? Let me know your position in the comment section. And with just 10 minutes of screen time, they were able to convince us that Wanda and Vision should have their own sitcom. And the cherry on top, it delivers every comic book fan's dream come true, the airport sequence. It's got action, it's got drama, it's got humor. This is another great film from the Russos. Real quick before I give you my top 3, remember to join me down below in the comment section. Share your ranking of all 24 MCU films. My list is not the right list. It's just my list, and I would love to see yours. Also, if you're enjoying this video, I've done a ton of MCU rankings in the past. The heroes, the villains, the final battles. If you want more content like this, check out this playlist up here. There's definitely something in there that you'll enjoy. In third place, Iron Man. Without needing to tie to other movies, set up any sequels, or outdo its predecessors, this movie can tell a simple story about a man's unlikely redemption. The magic here, and in most of the franchise, is that Robert Downey Jr. has incredible chemistry with everyone. He's just so naturally charismatic that he makes everyone around him better, and the character's humor is an outflow of his personality rather than obvious punchline setups. I also still strongly prefer Terrence Howard as Rhodey. Some of that is the performance and some of that is just the writing of the characters. Here, I think the bromance between them is best on display, but I think the two actors on screen have a lot of chemistry too. And this is another movie that has a bunch of new layers to it when you reinterpret it in light of Endgame. The dialogue between Tony and Pepper has all new meaning when you realize what happens with the two of them and what his ultimate fate is.
You're gonna kill yourself, Tony. I'm not gonna be a part of it.
I shouldn't be alive, unless it was for a reason. I just finally know what I have to do.
But this is the movie that cracked the code for how to do fun comic book movies that still had maturity and depth to them.
You did it! Congratulations!
The first movie in the MCU is still absolutely one of the best. Our runner-up, Avengers Endgame, the conclusion to the 11-year Infinity Saga, can truly be described as epic. The scope is massive, the action spectacular, and the emotions rich and resonant. For a movie known for fan service and spectacle, it actually has a lot to say about the different ways that people respond to tragedy and failure. With where Infinity War left things, these characters and this world are so broken that it provides all these new opportunities to see these characters in a new way and pull out big emotions. Though I will say the big Thor Bowski's arc played a little bit too much like an SNL parody than a serious exploration of depression.
Well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
And finally, Endgame let Rhodey stand on his own as a character. No pun intended. Okay, the pun was intended. And of course, the final hour of this movie is a perfect example of how to do fan service right. It's just jam-packed with Easter eggs, callbacks, payoffs that just put a huge grin on your face.
I knew it.
Of course it has spectacle to it, but there's also little gags and a bunch of truly heartfelt moments. And they found the perfect, most satisfying way to send off both Steve and Tony. In the end, it's a marvelous conclusion that leaves you satisfied on so many different levels. But in first place, Avengers Infinity War, Kevin Feige's magnum opus. Here the MCU delivered one of the biggest and most comic booky movies of all time.
Excellent.
Superficially, it's just incredibly enjoyable to watch all of these characters on screen together. As a blockbuster, it delivers big laughs, big emotions, massive set pieces, and a truly shocking finale. Like, I love the way this movie ends because it tells a complete story. Who's gonna get all the Infinity Stones? Thanos. The bad guy won. But what pushes this film to the #1 position is Thanos. They've crafted this truly terrifying villain who's still emotionally resonant. Though his actions are extreme and brutal, he's written to be multidimensional. He truly does love Gamora in his own way. We understand why he's doing all of these insane, mad things. This movie is everything that I want from a comic book movie, and as a massive fan of the MCU, this is the payoff of all their hard work. So Infinity War comes in at #1. If you enjoyed this ranking and one more like it, check out that playlist right over there. I've ranked the heroes, villains, final battles, and a whole lot more. If you want my more detailed thoughts on each of these movies, check out my spoiler reviews in that playlist down there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.